I was abandoned by my parents on my 16th birthday, just months before starting college. They made it clear they wanted me out so they could pursue their own ambitions without the burden of supporting me. Fast forward a decade, I'm now 26 and a father celebrating my son's 3rd birthday. The guest list was a mix of my son's friends from daycare, their parents, and some of my co-workers. Unexpectedly, my estranged parents, who had cut all ties with me, reached out wanting to reconcile. I warily invited them to the party. Our relationship had always been strained. I felt neglected throughout my childhood. Their focus was never on nurturing me, but rather on their personal goals. After they threw me out, I was forced to fend for myself, juggling jobs to afford living expenses, and eventually giving up my dream of a car to manage more immediate needs. During the birthday party, my parents showed a sudden interest in making amends. However, their true intentions surfaced quickly. They asked me for money. I was taken aback, but refused their request. In retaliation, they absurdly accused me of stealing $100,000 from them and attempted to sue me, a claim that had no basis in reality. This legal threat came after years of no support or contact, making their actions feel even more manipulative and unjust. It was a painful reminder of why I had distanced myself from them in the first place. Despite this, I've worked hard to build a stable and loving home for my son, far removed from the instability of my own upbringing. Growing up, my friends were great, but they had their own lives to lead, and naturally, they didn't have space for me to move in with them. Luckily, a distant relative, Uncle William, who was actually my mother's cousin, came to my rescue. He replied to my desperate email with an invitation to stay with him in Utah, on the condition that I help around the house and potentially work at his diner. Eager for a fresh start, I packed my bags without informing my parents or even bidding them farewell, as they seemed indifferent to my departure. Uncle William was a unique character, a bit eccentric but kind-hearted, and he had inherited a decent sum of money from his grandparents, allowing him to live comfortably without a direct family of his own. He ran a popular local diner and offered me a job there as a KFC cashier. In exchange for my hard work and commitment, he generously agreed to cover my college tuition. Working diligently at the diner, I proved my seriousness and gratitude. After graduating and moving on from Uncle William's home, I tried to repay him, but he insisted that he would call in the debt when I became a bigger success. Sadly, he passed away from a stroke a few years later, before he could see the full extent of his investment in me. I am forever grateful for his support, especially since he stepped in as a father figure at my wedding, a moment neither of my parents shared with me. As a child and even as an adult, Uncle William had a strained relationship with his own family, including my mother. Thus, my parents remained unaware of where I had been and who had financed my education. It wasn't until recently that they reached out through social media, having been informed by a cousin who traced me after hearing about my marriage and child. They expressed a desire to reconcile and meet my family, claiming regret over past actions. Their approach seemed lukewarm and I hesitated to respond. However, they quickly followed up, emphasizing their genuine intention to reconnect. Reflecting on everything, this unexpected outreach from my parents left me contemplating the ties of family and the paths we choose, or those chosen for us, shaping our lives in unforeseen ways. My grandparents were still around, eager to meet their great-grandson, yet it was clear they were playing on my emotions to make it happen. Despite this, I agreed to their visit, timing it with my son's birthday. I had no particular plans, but after discussing it with my wife, who's been with me through thick and thin for over 5 years, she was supportive as long as I felt comfortable. She understood my troubled past with my parents, who had ejected me from their life a decade ago. My wife had lost her parents early and was raised by her grandparents, who had both passed away recently. I sensed she yearned for some family connection at our son's party, though she never pressed it on me. Considering this, I decided to invite my parents for her sake. On the day, my parents arrived an hour before the other guests, giving us some private time, The encounter was strained, filled with awkward attempts at small talk. After introducing them to my wife and son, they remained polite and courteous initially. But the atmosphere shifted when my wife stepped into the kitchen to prepare tea for my dad. That's when my mother seized the moment to reveal their true intent. They weren't just here to reconcile, but were in dire need of financial help. They confessed to squandering much of their savings on travels, and now found themselves struggling to manage their bills. They knew my wife and I were in stable financial positions, she as a mortgage broker and I in branch manager. The sincerity of their earlier apologies faded, making it clear their visit was primarily a maneuver to solicit financial help. This revelation soured the mood, reducing their heartfelt apologies to mere strategic moves to secure financial aid. They had even leveraged their visit and the pretext of seeing their grandson to coax me into a softer stance. While their tactics were largely ineffective on me, they certainly left a bitter taste, overshadowing what could have been a genuine attempt at mending our fractured relationship. My wife, unfamiliar with the depth of my parents' past misdeeds, had initially been swept up by their show of remorse. Her own longing for familial connections made her particularly receptive to reconciling. Unfortunately, my reluctance to host them only grew as the visit unfolded, culminating in regret. I held back my true feelings initially, especially when she entered, smiling with refreshments, radiating happiness that I didn't want to dampen. As my parents subtly prodded me for a financial bailout under the guise of familial bonding, I deflected their inquiries, especially as party guests began arriving. My wife continued engaging with them, finding common ground easily, which contrasted sharply with my growing desire for their swift departure. The party's atmosphere lightened with the arrival of more guests, allowing me to immerse myself in hosting duties and the joyous task of celebrating my son's birthday. The cake cutting was a hit, and for a moment the tension ebbed. However, as the party wound down, my parents cornered me again for an answer about the money. Overwhelmed, I blurted out a sharp response and redirected them to mingle in the living room. Feeling cornered and needing to clear the air, I decided to address the elephant in the room. I gathered everyone and began what I intended as a candid speech about my turbulent past with my parents. While aiming to keep the tone light, I recounted how they had once expelled me from their lives, leading to a decade of silence, only broken recently by their desire to connect with their grandson, a gesture I suspected was motivated by their current financial woes. My narrative, sprinkled with humour, seemed to amuse the guests, though it visibly embarrassed my parents. My wife maintained a neutral expression throughout. I wrapped up the speech, half joking about my gratitude that their reunion attempt wasn't driven by financial greed, an attempt to lighten the mood that didn't entirely land as intended. As the evening concluded and guests departed, my parents left hurriedly, casting stern glances my way, though thankfully they spared me any confrontation. The real challenge came afterward, when it was just my wife and me. Before I could explain the full context of my parents' visit, she criticised the speech for overshadowing our son's birthday and unnecessarily shaming my parents publicly. She felt an apology was due, not just to my parents, but to our guests, for the discomfort caused. Her reaction stung, as it seemed my attempt to inject some honesty into the evening was now being viewed as a selfish spectacle. It was a tough pill to swallow, realising that what I felt was a necessary airing of long-held grievances was perceived as an inappropriate outburst that might have marred an otherwise joyful celebration. This misunderstanding underscored the complexities of handling personal and familial conflicts amidst social gatherings, leaving me to reflect on the balance between personal catharsis and public decorum. Reflecting on the contentious birthday party, I find myself torn between justified anger and familial expectations. It's clear to me that my son, being so young, wouldn't retain memories of the event, and most guests seemed amused by the humorous spin I gave my rather heavy story. my intent was to expose my parents' true characters, especially given their recent disappointing actions and previous estrangement. However, the fallout was immediate and intense. My wife, who initially encouraged the idea of inviting my parents hoping for reconciliation, was deeply upset by how I chose to handle the situation. She insisted I apologise to everyone for what she deemed inappropriate behaviour on a day that should have celebrated our son. I felt my stress peak, compounded by her reaction, which seemed disproportionate given that no guests expressed discomfort. Her response felt like a dismissal of my feelings, especially after she learned why my parents had really come. To ask for money, not merely to reconnect. In the heat of the moment, I argued that she was the one who had wanted them there, hoping she'd share some of the emotional burden. Unfortunately, my frustration only upset her more, leading her to tears. I tried to comfort her, but she accused me of being self-involved and hypocritical, a blow that led her to isolate herself in the guest bedroom since. Since that night, our home has been silent, with her unwilling to speak to me unless I apologised to our guests. But inside, I don't believe I was out of line. No guests have commented negatively on the incident, and I haven't heard from my parents either. It feels like my wife might be amplifying the situation in her mind, fearing judgment that isn't there. I'm stuck between wanting to maintain peace and feeling the need to stand my ground. I did invite my parents primarily for her, managing to keep my cool, initially despite their pressure. But when pushed too far, I responded the only way that felt right at the moment, revealing their true intentions publicly. This situation reveals deeper issues: my long-standing resentment towards my parents for abandoning me, and the fresh wounds from their latest betrayal. My wife's reaction, while meant to preserve decorum, overlooks the complexity of my feelings and our shared past experiences with my parents. I'm left pondering how to bridge this gap with my wife. I believe understanding and compassion should go both ways. I wish she could see that my outburst wasn't just about the party or our guests, but a culmination of years of suppressed hurt and disappointment. Reconciliation within our family, both immediate and extended, requires a deeper empathy for these entangled emotions, and I hope we can find a way to discuss this openly, beyond the surface tensions. I realised I could apologise to my wife for calling her self-involved. That wasn't fair or right, and I regret that. Beyond that, though, I genuinely felt there wasn't much more for which I needed to apologise. I could perhaps extend an apology to our guests if necessary, but I stood firm on not owing one to my parents, especially not after their attempt to use my son's birthday as a leverage for financial support following a decade of estrangement. After seeing mixed opinions on my initial story, I decided it was crucial to clear the air directly with my wife, since that's the foundation of a healthy marriage. It had been 3 tense days of silence and sleeping separately since the party, an arrangement that hardly went unnoticed, even if our young son might not fully grasp the situation. This morning, before heading to work, I approached her. Thankfully, she was willing to engage. Our son was busy with his breakfast, giving us a moment of privacy. I apologised for my harsh words during our last argument, but expressed that I didn't believe the party was ruined by my speech, as nobody had even mentioned it afterward. Not the guests, not even my parents. I explained as gently as I could that I felt she might have overreacted. To my relief, she agreed. She admitted that once her initial anger had subsided, she recognised that she had been selfish and not fully considerate of my feelings. She acknowledged that she had influenced the decision to invite my parents more than she had admitted, aiming for a picture-perfect family scenario she deeply desired but hadn't explicitly voiced. She confessed that her reaction was tied to her own deep-seated needs. Having been raised by her grandparents after her parents' early deaths, she yearned for our son to enjoy a close-knit family experience. She wanted him to have the grandparental love and attention she cherished in her childhood, a vision disrupted by the reality of our strained familial relationships. She apologized for letting these personal hopes cloud her judgment of the situation, recognizing the pressure it put on me. I, in turn, apologized for not being more open about my feelings from the start, acknowledging that better communication could have prevented the escalation. We agreed that therapy might be the best next step to navigate these complex emotional landscapes and ensure that our responses to each other and to family situations were healthy and constructive. This conversation was a breakthrough, a chance to understand each other's perspectives and emotions more deeply, paving the way for healing and stronger unity in our marriage. My wife and I have been attending individual therapy for a while, but given recent events and some other unrelated challenges, we've decided to start couples counselling as well. Thanks to everyone who commented with advice and support. But life threw another curveball my way courtesy of my parents. Out of the blue, they've slapped me with a lawsuit alleging that I stole $100,000 from them before I left home a decade ago. They claim to have finally tracked me down to get their money back. Needless to say, the accusations are baseless, and I pity the lawyer who's taken up their cause, must be desperate for the work. I'm not going to waste time on what I see as a ridiculous claim. I've already got my lawyer handling it. Following this development, my wife has retracted her earlier insistence that I apologise to my parents. She now sees more clearly the type of people they truly are. Previously, I might have handled their visit with more kindness, especially since it coincided with our son's birthday. Now, however, I see no need to hold back. I've decided to lay it all out online, detailing not just this ludicrous lawsuit, but also the past mistreatment I endured at their hands. I've gone ahead and shared every detail on my Facebook page. It's been about 29 minutes, and while I haven't received any direct responses yet, I'm bracing for the fallout. I mentioned how, despite family turning their backs on me in the past, they've recently been keen to rekindle ties now that I'm in a stable position, likely because it benefits them. My job in branch manager, potential connections, it all adds up to opportunistic motives for their newfound friendliness. After 5 days, the reaction has been intense. My parents freaked out over my posts, bombarding me with calls trying to get me to delete them. I held firm until they texted, promising to drop their lawsuit. I made sure to get that in writing. Post that, they blocked me. But the real drama came from other relatives I had named, who spewed vitriol under my post, targeting not just me, but also my wife and son. Ironically, it was their children who reached out to apologise for their parents' harsh words, showing more decency and maturity. I've since taken down the post, but it was up long enough to make its mark. Those who turned their backs on me have faced the music and, in a strange twist of fate, seen the consequences of their actions.